Good morning in Australia and good evening, I think it is, in New York. I'm Mark Baker and I'm involved in the New Israel Fund in Australia, and I'm also on the International Council. I'm filling in for Liam Gatroy, who is going to be conducting this interview. Liam is unwell. You don't have to worry, it's not from COVID-19, but he wasn't able to do it today. So he's asked me to step in, and it's a great privilege to be able to do that because I get to talk to Peter Beinart, who is a friend who I've known for a long time. He's been to Australia several times, and we were involved. We were both on a panel for the Wheeler Centre debating the whole question of Israel-Palestine. And I still recall when Peter arrived and the energy that he brought to this community. The day he arrived, it was Shavuot, and the night where people study Jewish texts all night, and we walked together through the rain to get to Habonim, where all the youth movements were gathering. And I know that Peter was very impressed by the huge turnout of youth here in Australia. So it's my great honour to be able to welcome Peter, who is going to be answering questions and speaking about matters relating to America and Israel, all the important issues of the day. There are lots of questions that we can ask him. And Peter is a very well-known journalist. He's an academic at CUNY, at the City University of New York, and he's a contributor to about 100 different newspapers. And they're all the distinguished ones. You often see Peter's face, not always with us, but on CNN, on every form of media, and he writes for the Atlantic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. I could go on forever. And Peter is also the author of several books: the Good Fight, the Icarus Syndrome, and a book that really created waves in relation to some of the topics that we're going to be talking about, the crisis of Zionism. And one of the questions that I want to end off with today is whether or not you wrote that in 2012, and you were well known for your article about the American Jewish establishment in Israel. And I think we're going to talk about that later. So it's my great honor. There are a lot of people who are tuning into this on Facebook and also on Zoom. A few days ago, Merav Michaeli, the member of Knesset, spoke, and I think there were about 200 people who tuned in. So even though everyone is in COVID quarantine, you're all feeling isolated, but there are actually, over 100 people who are listening to you. So we've got to take these questions and answers seriously. So for people tuning in now, once again, I'm Mark Baker and I'm interviewing Peter Beinart. And I thought I might just ask you, begin by asking you a question about journalism, because you're both a professional and an academic journalist. And I'm interested to know how you think this pandemic is going to change journalism. We're ourselves now doing something that we could have done in the past, but most people didn't know what Zoom was before. And it, in prior to the pandemic, we were still asking this question about journalism in relation to fake news and the impact that the Trump era had on journalism. And I want to bring both of those questions together, and for you to meditate for a moment about what it means to practice as a journalist, how you feel journalists should be confronting the fake news, how you feel watching the whole fiasco where journalists were asked to change seats in the Trump briefing, and to what extent journalists should be confronting those who have access to Trump, should be confronting him, and how one deals with this era of fake news, and how it will carry on with the pandemic, if there is an after.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm a great admirer of yours, and have just enjoyed immensely the time that I've spent in Australia. Really, there are few places in the world that I've enjoyed spending as much time as in Australia and in Melbourne in particular. And I hope one day in better days, we'll have the chance to do something like this in person. I think there are a series of different crises that journalism is facing. One of them is a kind of ethical crisis posed particularly by COVID-19, which is a very practical question we're really wrestling with our students, which is, when is it ethical to actually send people out to report? Yes, more reporting, of course, is being done virtually, as everything is being done virtually. But many of the most important stories that need to be reported have to be reported in person. And you have to go among the vulnerable people who cannot live remotely, especially, in the people in hospitals. The people in the United States, there's a kind of massive class divide where certain people can basically work remotely, but there are many, many people in service sector jobs who are not working remotely, who are out there suffering the consequences of this firsthand. And journalists have to make very difficult decisions about whether to put their own health at risk in order to go and cover those stories. So that's one challenge. The second is that certainly in the US, again, I can't speak for other places, the recession/depression that we are now entering into economically is taking an already very, very fragile business of journalism and really, for many publications, putting a last nail in the coffin. I mean, local newspapers in the United States were already in enormous crisis. And now, if businesses don't have the money to advertise, people don't have the money to subscribe, I fear we may come out of this, when we do come out of it, with a much weakened and hollowed out journalistic ecosystem. And that's again, the decline of local newspapers and local journalism in the United States is particularly devastating because we have a federal system. So you desperately need, national reporting is fine, but you desperately need local and state reporting to focus, to make sure that, try to keep corruption in check in 50 different local states that each have significant power. And I fear that that's going to be eroded. And then the last point, which didn't start with the coronavirus, but has been with us for several years now, is the crisis of how to cover Donald Trump. How do you cover a pathological liar who kind of, in Orwellian ways, in kind of pathetic and yet also Orwellian ways, will simply say things and deny having said them day in and day out, the most absurd, ridiculous, vicious things. I think what you've seen is that the highbrow American press, the New York Times and the Washington Post, has actually shifted the way they've, in response to this. So for instance, it's much more common, you'll see in the New York Times, the Washington Post, than you did before, basically to just straight out say that Trump is lying, that what he said is not true. The norms of objectivity that existed before, where you kind of had to soft pedal that on the news section of the papers, have gone to a significant degree by the wayside. It's also true on a network like CNN, that there's they're much more blunt, and they have become more blunt in response to Trump. And there's been a tremendous amount of very good journalism done by the prestige newspapers and by other publications. But the problem is that what we've learned, sadly, is that it really doesn't really matter how many times you prove that Trump is lying. It doesn't really even matter that much how many scandals you uncover, because the 40%, 40 to 45% of Americans who support Donald Trump are not really listening to this media very much. They have their own separate ecosystem of kind of, I would say, quote unquote journalism, led by Fox News, but with a whole smaller, kind of other cadre of websites and talk radio hosts. And Trump has successfully delegitimized the kind of actual American media, the legitimate American media, to such an extent, it's very, very difficult to break through with those folks, the people who most desperately need to realize that they're being lied to, and that our constitutional system is being threatened. And that, I think, has been a source of tremendous, tremendous frustration for many, many journalists, that as good as the work they do, that oftentimes it just doesn't feel like it's getting through to the people who really need to hear it.
Right. So, so I'd like to ask you a big question about Trump, and then we're going to sort of delve deeper into the various Democratic candidates and the election and how you see it panning out. But I think a lot of people, and I imagine most people who've tuned into into this webinar, particularly from Australia, ponder how it is that Trump still has support in America. You know, only yesterday or the day before, his comments, you know, the super brain scientist, and telling people, you know, about using disinfectant and you know, and comparing that, it makes the impeachment on the sort of the Ukraine affair pale into insignificance. And yet he still seems to garner support, and he's still a serious contender, I imagine, to win the election. And if you can perhaps explain, you know, what it is. We're living in quarantine bubbles, but before that, we're perhaps those bubbles are thickening the political bubbles that we're living in. But if you can explain to an Australian audience that, you know, that does have, you know, we're divided between various political parties, but I think in particular in response to this pandemic, there has been bipartisan support with some issues around the closure of schools, but there has been bipartisan support more or less for the way the government has been dealing with this. And, you know, Australia is traveling very, very well compared to other countries. We don't feel like a failed state, and yet, you know, people are using that language around America. So yeah. Can you explain the phenomenon of Trump and his support?
So look, I think many ways we Americans are struggling to make sense of this ourselves. There's a way in which, you know, you live your life in a country, and you feel that you know the country. But you know, there's a famous book. There's a book, you know, that actually sometimes you don't know your country as well as you think, or that countries like, you know, like individuals or families can take. There can be things that were under the surface that you didn't really see. I think the most fundamental thing to understand, I think, that try to understand the Trump phenomenon, is that America is a young democracy. It doesn't seem that way. You know, it seems like our democracy goes back to 1776 and the Constitution. But if you think about America as a multiracial democracy, a country where African Americans in particular had the right to vote, America is really only a democracy since 1965. So in many ways, we are not so different than a country like Brazil. Our democracy is young and fragile. For most of the vast majority of our history, it has been a democracy for white people. And I think, to me, the fundamental story about Trump is the question of whether America can survive as a multiracial democracy. And I think what happened, starting with 1965, but slowly happened over the decades, is that African Americans and other people of color began to actually start to amass some genuine political power in the United States. That was exemplified, of course, most dramatically by the election of Barack Obama. And that the backlash against that is the fundamental story of the Trump presidency. Or to put it a different way, America is founded on two competing principles. One was a stated commitment to liberal democracy, to individual rights, and to government by the people. And it was also founded in a very fundamental way on white supremacy. And the tension between those two principles was not as evident in a period when Black people could not really assert their rights. But now, as African Americans and with a rising Latino population have really, really meant that American democracy is genuinely challenging white supremacy. What you are seeing is that people who are deeply invested in white supremacy are basically willing to take apart America's democratic institutions in order to make sure that white supremacy is maintained. And I think, to me, I would say that is the master narrative, I think, ultimately, of the Trump presidency. And I think the reason that people are willing to forgive Trump so many things, his supporters and other Republicans are willing to basically look the other way, and the reason he has so much such robust support despite everything is really the fact that his supporters see him as the person standing at the barricade against essentially an America that looks like Barack Obama running their lives, which is to say an America in which the hierarchies of race in particular, but not also of gender, that they are clinging to are potentially being threatened. I think that's why immigration has become the most central issue for Trump, because immigration has come to symbolize the idea of America's fundamental racial identity being overturned. And I think for Trump supporters, it is the idea that he is the person who's standing in the doorhouse blocking that is the thing that binds him to his supporters the most fundamentally. And I think that, we'll talk about it more, but I think one of the central questions of this election is going to be how difficult do Donald Trump and Republicans make it to vote in the United States this election?
Right. So perhaps we might talk about some of the candidates. It's now being narrowed down to Biden, but in terms of the candidates who could oppose that narrative and who might have been able to build a coalition that would beat Trump, and if we can start off with Sanders, and getting some questions from people who are here who are particularly asking about the different candidates and their own capacities to beat Trump. So let's start off with Sanders, and some of you might have read the Philip Roth book, The Plot Against America, or watching it now on TV. So if we do a counterfactual history and imagine that Sanders would have won the Democratic nomination, it's not finalized yet, but imagine that he would have. You've got a Larry David kind of character, a Jew who represents a word that one would have thought would be anathema to the American public, socialism. He calls himself a democratic socialist. So I'm interested for you to talk a bit about what you think Sanders represented, how he, whether or not why he didn't manage to maintain the momentum in his movement, how you think he would have fared against Trump, and also his Jewishness, because he was relatively silent about his Jewishness until it seemed to be a campaign asset. And I'm interested, in light of what you're saying about Trump, whether you think his Jewishness was an asset. A lot of people in the older generation said anyone but Sanders, they would be worried, they'll blame the Jews for all the problems. So if you can just talk a bit about Sanders and what you think he meant for American politics.
Yeah, I mean, look, Sanders will go down as one of the most fascinating figures in contemporary American political history. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate how marginal a figure Bernie Sanders was prior to him running for the nomination in 2016. I mean, he was a senator from Vermont. He was the only socialist in the United States Senate, and he was a gadfly. I mean, when he ran against Hillary Clinton, when he announced for president in 2016, not very many reporters even came to Burlington, Vermont to cover his announcement for president. He had been but I think he was part of a tradition in the United States that has always been there. You can go back to William Jennings Bryan, the populist candidate at the turn of the century, or Eugene Debs, or Norman Thomas, the longtime socialists of the first part of the 20th century, or Henry Wallace in 1948, George McGovern, Jesse Jackson in the 1980s. America does have this populist socialist tradition. If America were a multi-party system, which it's not, those folks might have their own party. It would be a small party, kind of like a Green Party, let's say, in some other country. But it's never really come close to taking over the Democratic Party. And Sanders really, I mean, McGovern for a very brief period in '72, but then he was beaten very badly. I think that to understand what happened with Sanders, you have to go back to two things. The first, the Iraq War, and secondly, and even more importantly, the financial crisis. So the Iraq War and the financial crisis in both parties, I think, seriously discredited the establishments of both parties. And many Democrats had supported the Iraq War, and many Democrats were implicated in the financial crisis because of deregulation of the financial markets. And so you saw after the first sign of Sanders-ism was the Occupy movement, which emerged out of nowhere in the United States, and for a brief period was a massive, massive movement of people, particularly young people, who were calling for accountability because in the wake of the financial crisis. And as what happened in this, this is some way similar to McGovern. McGovern's nomination in '72 came as out of the anti-war movement. This movement that emerged with Occupy started to have political effects. And it was led by young people who, because they came into adulthood in the wake of the financial crisis and the Great Recession, had not been able to find their feet economically. We're suffering huge levels of often college debt, because what's happened is that states don't give as much money to their public universities anymore, so they charge huge tuition that people have to take out debt in order to pay for, and they can't pay back the debt. The American welfare system, which is very weak, is what generally we have as a welfare system goes to the elderly. So this generation, millennials, were finding that economically it was extraordinarily rough. And it was a multiracial generation with liberal political attitudes. So instead of generally responding with the way that by supporting Trumpism and demonizing immigrants and people of color, they moved to the political left. And without the Soviet Union around anymore, they didn't know the Soviet Union, never been alive for the Cold War. Socialism didn't have the negative connotations. And Trump became the vehicle for this. And in 2020, it looked at a certain point very likely that he would be the Democratic nominee. I mean, in the first three states that voted, Iowa, he basically tied. New Hampshire, he won. And Nevada, the third state, he won by quite a large margin. There's really no precedent in American political history for a candidate, since we started basically having party primaries like we do now, which goes back to the 1970s, no precedent for a candidate essentially winning the first three states and not winning the nomination. Biden looked really dead in the water. He had raised very little money. His campaign organization was terrible. He was pretty terrible in the debates. Sanders had not only his core base of young white people, but had shown in Nevada, which is a state with a large Latino population, a real ability to basically galvanize Latino voters. And he had raised far more money than anybody else with small donations. And looked, I thought, like he was headed to the nomination. Then this kind of thing happened in South Carolina. Again, there's really no precedent for it, which is that in South Carolina, which is a state without that many liberal white people, where a majority of Democratic voters are African American, and the white voters are also more conservative, more religious, that African American voters saved Joe Biden. They stuck with Joe Biden in overwhelming numbers, even though African American left intellectuals are not fans of Joe Biden. I mean, he was the author of the crime bill that led to vast numbers of African Americans being incarcerated. And yet African Americans basically did not move to Bernie Sanders. In South Carolina in particular, stuck with Joe Biden in huge numbers, partly because of loyalty to Barack Obama. I think one of the reasons that people, when Sanders seemed like they were winning, a lot of people said, okay, we see what's going on here. This is like Jeremy Corbyn taking over the Labour Party, right? Similar story of a very left-wing gadfly becoming the leader of a party. Or it's like Donald Trump, the insurgent populist, taking over the Republican Party. I think the reason it didn't play out that way in the Democratic Party really boils down to two words: Barack Obama. The reason that Bernie Sanders ultimately failed was that even though you had this leftist contingent in the Democratic Party, which had become quite radical, the base of the Democratic Party, unlike in the Labour Party, where Tony Blair had been discredited, and unlike in the Republican Party, where George W. Bush had been discredited, Barack Obama remained an enormously popular figure among most Democrats, especially among African-American Democrats. And those African-American voters stuck with Joe Biden, I think in part out of loyalty to Obama, him having been Obama's vice president, and partly because African-Americans, although they are very far to the left, are not politically identical to white leftists in the United States. they tend to be much more pessimistic about the nature of the country. There's a certain political realism or political pessimism that you see in the African American community. And I think a lot of African Americans simply did not think that that America would vote for Bernie Sanders. And they were desperate to get rid of Donald Trump, and they thought that Joe Biden was more electable. And once Biden revived his candidacy by winning South Carolina, all of the other moderate candidates essentially dropped out. I think Obama's hand was partly behind this. Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Michael Bloomberg, all threw their support to Biden. And there was this just radical transformation in the election. And Biden won a whole series of states. And then the coronavirus came along and basically shut down the ability to hold elections. So it's been a very strange, unprecedented kind of election. Would say, look, how to answer the question of whether Sanders could win is difficult. I would say that if you looked at head-to-head polling against Trump, Sanders didn't do that badly. There were some people who thought that Sanders' anti-establishment, anti-free trade message might help win back some disaffected working class voters in the upper Midwest states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, perhaps. Sanders was counting on a huge turnout of young people, but it's worth noting that he didn't get the youth turnout he needed in the primary, which I think probably cast some doubt on whether he could have gotten in the general election. One thing is clear is that Democratic Party politicians were very, very, very worried about Sanders. They certainly felt that Sanders was a weak general election candidate who could even bring them down in some of their congressional races. So anyway, I feel like I've been talking a lot. I can talk about Sanders' Jewishness if you want, or we can leave that for another question.
Well, if you can just say something about his Jewishness and how that came to play out later in his campaign and all those advertisements.
Sanders' Jewishness is the Jewishness of people who believe that class is more important than religion and ethnicity, right? This is also a Jewish tradition, right? This is the tradition from Karl Marx to Leon Trotsky to Rosa Luxemburg to many, many Jews who made a conscious decision that they didn't want to see the world in ethnic and religious terms. They wanted to see the world in class terms and believed that that would be better for the Jews to see the world in class terms, right? So that's Sanders. Now, what's interesting is that in the United States, one of the problems is that America is a very religious country. And that there are elements of the Democratic base that are very religious, African Americans in particular. And Sanders' secularism, I think, was a political liability more than his Jewishness. The fact that he was not comfortable with a language of faith, a language of God. Joe Lieberman was very easily could be very easily assimilated for American Christians. Bernie Sanders, a Jew who's ethnically Jewish but has no relationship with Judaism, is much harder. I think that would have been a problem for him in the general election. I think it probably hurt him with both black and white Democrats in South Carolina, which is more conservative. He started talking more about his Jewishness in the 2020 campaign. And generally the way he talked about it was essentially to say, I know oppression, I know bigotry, I can be relied on to stand for all people who are oppressed and discriminated against. And I think that was authentic to him. And there were actually some quite really moving moments. So for instance, one of the remarkable things is that Sanders had incredible support from Muslim Americans, overwhelming support among Muslim Americans. And I think that there were ways in which his sense of being a victim of his family having been killed in the Holocaust really did break across some of those lines with Muslims and with Latinos. But again, ultimately, it wasn't enough to win him the nomination.
Right. So there are quite a few questions coming in about where women figure in all of this. The female candidates were knocked out of the race, and it ended up with a contest between sort of two old men, and we can talk about that in relation to the vice presidency as well. But if you can say something about what you think happened to candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who seem to be doing very well, to Harris in the more moderate camp. So if you can make some comments about the moderate camp and as well the role that women played in this, and when America will be, is America clearly they're ready for a woman as president. But what happened here?
Yeah. Look, I think early on, people thought Kamala Harris was a very strong candidate. And certainly there was quite a stretch there, I would say, starting in the summer into the fall of last year when Elizabeth Warren was essentially close to something of a front runner. I think, the American presidency is not just a head of government. It's a head of state. It's not just electing someone to run the government. It's essentially our combination of prime minister and king. It's in a very large and diverse country. This is the person that represents national identity. And I think that we have learned again and again, unfortunately, that there are very deeply baked in sexist, gendered kind of prisms and assumptions that are very, very, very difficult for women candidates in that system, given the particular role of the presidency. Women have, been able to get elected to be governors and senators and members of Congress, and Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House. But I think that there is this visceral sense of transgression that a lot of men and some more conservative women feel about women candidates, and they don't express it as such. They don't say in polls, we don't want a woman president. They say, sure, I'm fine with a woman president. But then they judge those candidates by different metrics, different standards. I mean, the fact that there's a kind of a sense that I don't feel as comfortable with this person, or a tendency to judge much more harshly. I mean, Hillary Clinton got the reputation as being as dishonest. If you looked at polls, people said that Hillary Clinton was almost as dishonest as Donald Trump. That was absurd. If you just look at the fact checkers who look at how many lies candidates told, Hillary Clinton was actually a very honest candidate compared to almost everybody else. Elizabeth Warren was raked over the coals for this, I think, really trumped up, nonsensical pseudo scandal about the fact that she said that she had Native American ancestry when she probably did, but she couldn't kind of actually prove it. In Oklahoma, where she's from, a lot of people have some Native American ancestry. And again, I think that Warren was ultimately one of the issues that really hurt her tremendously was the fact that she supported Medicare for all, which again, in Australia, most kind of civilized countries would be considered a kind of a no-brainer, a single-payer healthcare system. But in the United States is a very radical shift. And she was really suffered enormously because people didn't think that she had been quite straightforward about how she would pay for it. Well, you know what? She was a lot more straightforward than Bernie Sanders was about how he was going to pay for it. He never came up with any remotely realistic plan about how America was going to make this transition. And yet it didn't seem to hurt him as much. So, hopefully, over the years, this will become less of a problem. But I think we find every 4 years, we find how power that although the progressive instinct is always to believe that history moves ever forward in a kind of in a progressive direction, that things get better and better, that things like this deep sexism is very, very ingrained and inbuilt in the way Americans process their political candidates.
Right. So we'll come back to that in relation to Biden. I just wanted to say that there are probably about over 100 people who are watching this, and it's also being streamed on Facebook. So I'm not sure how many are watching it there. And people are asking questions and asking why they can't see the questions they're asking. I can see them, and I'm doing my best to, without naming people, integrate the questions that you're asking, and they'll be coming to more of them. So if we can just talk a bit about Biden, because clearly, Biden was feared by Trump, and Trump saw him as the leading candidate. But I think there was a long period when people didn't believe that his chances were so high, that he had a lot of weaknesses, and those weaknesses are still apparent. I just listened to a podcast on the Intercepted in which they really tore into smithereens about they accused him of being a serial liar. They talked about they talked about his mental stability, and in some ways drew comparisons with Trump, not in terms of him being as unstable, but that he wasn't somebody who had the strength to be a candidate who could beat Trump. So if you could say something about, you've already commented on it, but about Biden's sudden win to the presidential nomination, and whether there can be whether the system allows for a last minute change. I don't know if that's at all possible, but if he will his weaknesses overcome him? Can he beat Trump? How do you see it playing out?
I think the first thing to say about Joe Biden is that he was elected to the United States Senate in 1972. So he's one of the reasons that he's so difficult, I think, for many people on the left of the Democratic Party to swallow, is that he was, a major Democrat in the Senate at a time when the center of gravity ideologically in the Democratic Party was very different than it is now. I mean, what's basically happened in the United States since the 1960s is that the Democratic Party has moved to the left and become a progressive party, and the Republican Party has become a conservative party. Back in the 1970s and even into the 1980s, when Joe Biden was, taking all these positions on, that wasn't the case. The Democratic Party had a much more conservative wing, and Biden reflected to that. His opposition to busing, to integrate schools, for instance, his very hawkish, his kind of very tough on crime policies, his kind of tough treatment of Anita Hill when she testified against Clarence Thomas on sexual harassment. These things are now considered kind of horrifying to younger progressive Democrats, but they reflect the fact that the center of gravity of the Democratic Party was very different in those previous eras. And Biden has all of the baggage of being someone of that generation. Sanders was the kind of the outlier, the one person who essentially was not in the mainstream of the Democratic Party at a time when the Democratic Party was not nearly as left as it has become. And I think that a lot of people thought that Biden would never overcome all of that baggage. He did, I think, again, for two main reasons. First, I think because of the loyalty that African Americans felt because of his support for Barack Obama. I think for African Americans, particularly older African Americans, the fact that Biden, an older white man, had been a loyal vice president to a younger African American president was very, very meaningful, and in ways that perhaps some white pundits did not quite recognize. Secondly, the Democrats are really terrified about Donald Trump's reelection. I mean, and I think this election, more than any other election, Democrats have become really obsessed with the idea of electability, finding the candidate who they think can appeal to those people who might have voted for Donald Trump. Maybe some of those people who voted for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. Who's the candidate who can bring them back? And I think there were a lot of people who were convinced. Go ahead.
Now, one of the questions, just I'm interrupting you, related to that, and was saying that the Republicans seem to be picking candidates who have popular appeal, whereas the Democrats were focused much more on policy, and we're choosing candidates on policy more than on their electability. So I
wouldn't say they chose him on policy. I mean, one of the things about Biden is that he really didn't. If you think about the policy debates in the Democratic Party and who was leading those debates, it was really Sanders and Warren, and maybe to some degree people like Buttigieg, where Biden was not really associated with any creative policy thinking, really. Mm-hmm. I think that the thing that ultimately was probably the biggest driving force was the sense that he was the most electable candidate because he was not threatening to more older, more and moderate or conservative white voters, and because he had Black support. Remember, there were other moderate candidates who emerged, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, but they were not able to gain really any African American support. And interestingly, even the African American candidates like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, didn't get that much African American support. I think, again, because African Americans were very pessimistic about the prospect of them being able to beat Donald Trump. I mean, just in the other room. One of the things that it's worth remembering is that, sorry, my daughter.
There's more than one that's walked in.
Barack Obama was not winning the African American vote in the 2008 primary until he won Iowa, which is to say, until African Americans saw that people in Iowa, which is an overwhelmingly white state, would vote for Barack Obama over Hillary Clinton in 2008, they were not supporting Barack Obama. And that has to do, I think, with the deep pessimism of African Americans about the willingness of white Americans to vote for African American candidates. And I think that's part of what hurt Cory Booker and Kamala Harris a lot. It's a very strange election. Biden is a poor candidate in a lot of ways. He's not shown the ability to raise much money. He's not very inspirational. He's not a malicious pathological liar like Trump. He is a kind of guy who likes to tell a good story and doesn't let the facts get in the way of a good story. If you remember, he had to leave the 1988 presidential campaign because basically he took this line of the British Labour leader Neil Kinnock and basically appropriated it for himself without attribution. It's not like Trump, but I think for Biden to win, the Democratic Party as a whole will have to basically drag him across the finish line, which is to say that Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and the institutional advantages of the Democratic Party will have, and it will have to be to some degree a referendum on Trump. And it could be, Trump has never had high his popularity rating has never really gotten above 45%. It's always been in this 40 to 45% range. And now the economy is really weak, which it was not up until, for the first 3 years of his presidency. So he's beatable. Biden is a very flawed candidate. He's a very flawed candidate, but all the other Democrats look like flawed candidates too.
So if you can, and this is the last question I want to ask you before we move on to talking about Israel and US-Israel relations, because I want to leave time for that. But if you could pick your ideal combination of candidates prior to Biden being nominated and now, given the reality of Biden being the nominee, how important is it to choose a woman? He's committed to that. Who do you think the ideal combination would be? And as I said, if you can say that, who you would have liked to have seen and what you think will happen.
So first of all, the history of American presidential candidates is that running mates rarely make much of a difference at all. So people kind of obsess about them a lot, but they don't generally have much of an impact at all. I think there are two schools of thought about the Biden pick. The first would be that he kind of doubles down on his effort to win back moderate Midwestern voters in the key states. Remember what happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton was supposed to have this blue wall, right? The blue wall was Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which were states that had voted Democratic the last several elections, and that gave her the margin to win, even if she lost Florida, as she did. And Trump broke through that blue wall with a huge turnout of working class, of non-college educated white voters in particular. So Biden was considered, people thought, to have some ability to win some of those folks back. I think Hillary Clinton's gender hurt her there. And the idea would be to choose someone like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, or Amy Klobuchar, who's from Minnesota, and really focus on that part of the country and those voters. The other school of thought is that Biden is the nominee because of black voters. They were the ones who saved him. And that another reason that Hillary Clinton lost was that African-American vote really turnout dipped in 2016 pretty significantly. And Biden cannot afford to thumb his nose at the African-American voters who brought him to where he is, and he has to choose an African-American candidate. Now, the problem is that Biden, there are not very many African-American, there's only one African-American woman in the Senate, and there are no African-American governors. So there are figures like Stacey Abrams, who ran and lost for governor in Georgia, who a lot of Democrats find quite exciting and inspirational. But I think it's unlikely Biden is going to choose somebody. I mean, Biden's 78 years old. So whoever he chooses as running mate, could actually end up being president. And I think he's going to have a hard time justifying choosing someone who hasn't even run a state or been in the Senate. And that really leaves you with Kamala Harris, who's the only African-American woman in the Senate. There are no African-American governors. She is good on the stump. I think she'd be good at attacking Trump. And so if I had to guess, I think she's the most likely nominee. And the Democrats will hope that she brings up African-American turnout a little bit.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to Israel and particularly how it relates to American Jews and also to American politics. The Trump on July 1st, in this surprise so-called emergency coalition where Gantz jumped ship, there's going to be a vote on annexation, which relates to the implementation of the Trump plan, of the deal of the century. It probably relies on Trump giving the green light, or Jared Kushner. And I'm interested to hear from you how you view this playing out. How do you think Trump will react when, come July the 1st? Is he an important figure in the decision that will be made in the Knesset, or will he just be too preoccupied with COVID-19 to be worrying about dealing with these issues, or is it an election card for him to play?
Well, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has basically already said it's Israel's decision; they can do whatever they want, that doesn't surprise me, and I would be surprised if that changed. I mean, I think that Trump, I think, views this from a purely kind of electoral, political standpoint of what's in it for him. The people in the government, the kind of professional diplomatic class in the United States that in previous administrations would have pushed back against a president who thought this was in their political interest and said, look, this is very dangerous for the country, has been so hollowed out. We don't really have a functioning State Department. I don't think that there are people who will have an influence who will actually reflect that view, because the policymaking process in that regard has really broken down. I suppose if there were anyone who could get Trump to try to stop this, it would probably be Sisi in Egypt or King Abdullah in Jordan, who might have some weight with Trump. I mean, Sisi in particular is quite popular with Trump and the Republicans in general. And if they were to say, listen, we're going to break relations with Israel, hell's going to break loose. We're putting the U.S.-Egypt relationship on the line here. You can't go along with this. That would be, or maybe the Saudis, although I don't think the Saudis seem likely to do that. I think that would be the one, I think, possibility. But I think Trump will see this as good politics for him, because it'll allow him to show that he's more pro-Israel than the Democrats. And I don't think you can, again, I don't think you can discount the influence at all of Sheldon Adelson here. Sheldon Adelson has been one of Trump's biggest and most loyal supporters. And I think Sheldon Adelson has tremendous influence in the Trump White House, with Kushner and with Trump in particular. Trump is going to want and need, I mean, again, this stuff can kind of bleed into what can sound like kind of anti-Semitic tropes, but I think the truth is that it's very important that Trump gets Sheldon Adelson's financial support, and he has shown a real willingness to, I think, to do what Sheldon Adelson wants, and so I would be surprised if Donald Trump does anything to stop this.
Right. So when you wrote your book, The Crisis of Zionism, you were already saying then it was, 1 minute to good night.
Yeah, good.
That it was that it was 1 minute to midnight for the two-state solution, and you talked about there being a democratic Israel on one side of the green line and an undemocratic Israel, and you even, I think, spoke about it. What was at the time you used the language of a Zionist I don't know if you said BDS, but I
Yeah.
think you did, and it kind
Yeah.
of accompanied the publication of
Yeah.
your book.
Yeah.
So 8 years later, if the annexation proposal does go through,
Yeah.
and there is approval to annex the Jordan Valley and parts of the
Yeah.
West Bank, and
Yeah.
how has that changed your view? Are we, are we 1 minute past midnight, and what does that mean for you as somebody who is pro-Israel, a Zionist? How do you interpret that?
Gosh, Mark, this is the kind of thing that I feel like, you and I need to spend many hours with a few bottles of wine over. I feel like, you
I've
and
got
I,
coffee here for you.
I feel like, one of the great blessings for me of writing about these subjects has been that I feel like I have met people around the world who I feel like not just think the same way that I do, but I feel like feel the same as I do. And I think that part of what that feeling is, and I think you were, very much one of them. I felt that way from the first time we met. Is a sense of being ripped apart. Two parts of my identity, essentially, in just mounting more and more profound conflict. There's a part of me that just finds it enormously emotionally difficult to turn my back on the idea of a Jewish state. It seems kind of unimaginable. On the other hand, there is a moment at which one has to start to say that the ability to have our cake and eat it too, which is to say to have a democratic Jewish state, that forces in the world that we have fought against, done our best to fight against, that we've lost. So a two-state solution remains my preference. I am bitterly angry at those people in the United States, in our Jewish community, who ostensibly supported a two-state solution, ostensibly, and yet have only fueled this move towards destroying the two-state solution. And then we'll turn around and look at anyone who thinks about alternatives and talks about a democratic one state and call them anti-Semites, when they had the capacity to use some of their influence. Even today, I won't name names, but there are people who have not spoken up, who claim to support a two-state solution, even as we see this kind of nail being put in the coffin. We Jews do believe in resurrection of the dead, right? It is a Jewish theological principle. So perhaps, if we can all be resurrected, then the two-state solution can be resurrected. I certainly will fight for any remaining slim hope that it can be saved, but I would also say that I do think there has to be a conversation, and I'm really trying to wrestle with thinking about how I write about this, and I'm going to try, I think, to think about what kind of principles for people who believe in liberal democracy, but people who also deeply believe in the importance of a Jewish community in the land of Israel that can live with safety and dignity. What are the principles that would have to govern our perspective on one democratic equal state? And it's not my preference. My preference remains the two-state solution. But I think I personally have gotten to the place where I feel like I have to give much more thought and start to try to think about writing about what principles should govern the way we think about this reality, because I simply will never be able to accept the notion of a state that controls the lives of millions and millions of people who lack basic rights.
Right. So in a way, there's an internal schism and an external one. The internal one is within American Jews, diaspora Jews. The external one is between diaspora Jews and Israel. So when you talk about resurrection of the dead, Israelis will say, it's Yom HaZikaron tomorrow, and it's our children, our boys, as they're often called, but it's boys and women are on the front lines. And when we talk about death, they're the ones risking our lives. So what role do you see the diaspora communities? America is in a very different position because, and this brings us back to the question of Biden's candidacy. What role do you see diaspora Jews playing in resisting occupation, both in America, and if you can perhaps speak, Australia? It's how do you think Australians should be, who want to impact on this? How do you think they should be acting?
I mean, look, I think that what we owe is, we're not infallible, certainly. But I think what we owe Israel is our best understanding, as flawed as it may be, strategically and morally, for what is in the best interests of Israeli Jews in particular, and also of Palestinians. So we also have moral obligations too. I don't believe, I believe that Israel has been made arrogant, this Israeli leadership, by the fact that particularly that they've been able to act with impunity. But I think that there will be deep, terrible consequences for Israel for foreclosing the two-state solution. It doesn't matter. Israel may think, Benjamin Netanyahu may think he's won because some sheikhs in the Gulf don't care about the Palestinians and because the Chinese and the Indians are not giving him a hard time. But ultimately, the Israeli Jews are living side by side with 50% of the people between the river and the sea who are Palestinians, and those people will not accept permanent subjugation. They will rise up and make life hell for Israeli Jews in some way or another, sooner or later, because people will simply not lie down and accept their lack of basic rights forever. And I think that's something that we have the right and the obligation to say. I would also say, again, for the American perspective in particular, we are not neutral bystanders here. Right? This is one of the reasons that I've been talking and writing over the last year or so about military aid, right? Which is to say, it is our American U.S. taxpayer dollars that are being used to enforce these immoral policies that I feel like are devastating to Palestinians and ultimately devastating to Israeli democracy. And so, at the very least, Americans, including American Jews, have the right to say to Israel, you know what? You can do what you want, but we do not want our money to go to support policies that we feel like threaten Israeli democracy.
So Peter, will Biden, my last question, will Biden do that before the election and after? Will he make aid to Israel conditional on not going ahead with annexation?
I think it's probably unlikely. I should caveat, I do not support, I support certain kinds of conditions on aid, but not conditions that would prevent Israel from having things like Iron Dome and Arrow and missile defense systems to protect themselves from rocket fire. It's a much more kind of targeted kind of conditionality that I would support, that I don't think threatens Israeli security at all. Sanders had taken that position. Biden is a traditionalist in the sense that he has very long-standing ties to the American Jewish establishment, and I feel like, to a large degree, feels that he doesn't want to take a lot of political risks on this issue. He was actually, and I've reported about this, he was the most prominent person in the Obama administration to oppose the abstention on the UN settlement veto. So unfortunately, I don't see Biden doing this unless he's under tremendous political pressure from the left.
Right. So there are more questions, but we've run out of time, and I just want to ask you, firstly, thank you for being part of the session, and just ask how, just very briefly, how it feels to be in New York. I don't know exactly where you are now, but unlike Australia, where we're in lockdown in the same way as you are, the death count is much lower, and the virus, the government is saying that we might even eliminate it, although there's always the fear of a spike. For you living in New York, how does it feel?
Look, our family, thank goodness, has been safe. But look, this is a part of a larger reckoning for the United States. There's this notion that the United States was the best, that we led the world, which is something that I think a lot of Americans of a certain older Americans in particular, tended to just kind of assume, and that certainly was still the conversation that existed in the United States in the 1990s, after the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan and the financial crisis, and now our government's pathetic, disastrous response to this, and also the way it's shown that our lack of a strong social safety net has made us so vulnerable. I feel like there's a reckoning. I think younger Americans are much less likely to think that the United States is leading the world in important ways, and that the great question for all of us is, can this be for us Americans, like the Depression was, a moment of reckoning that leads us to start to actually build the kind of institutions, the kind of social safety net that actually makes us a more decent and functional country. And I think that's a big question that many New Yorkers and many Americans are asking now.
So we have to end there, Peter, and I just want to thank you for always your wonderful insights on behalf of the New Israel Fund, which everyone knows does incredible work in supporting NGOs on the ground, transforming Israel. I know you're a supporter of it, Peter, and just thanks for enlarging our world while we're all locked down in quarantine. A lot of people joined here. Right? There was a message from someone in Baltimore who was listening. Somebody who's jogging around the park, getting some fresh air, was listening to this. So to all of those who are listening, thank you for joining. It will be streamed on Facebook, on YouTube. If you follow the New Israel Fund Australia on Twitter and on Facebook, you'll get details of that. So I'm sure a lot more people will listen to this conversation. I hope you and your family, we saw a lot of your family coming in and out, stay well, and hope to see you when all the borders open up. Hope to see you back in Australia. So
I'd like that very much.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. It was my pleasure.
Thanks.